The first thing you must understand, before anything else, is that some doors are never meant to be opened. And yet, here you are, staring into the darkness behind one of the most chilling human acts ever recorded. It's 1846. A sprawling plantation, a night sky so black it swallows the moon. And in a decaying barn at the edge of the property, a man locks his pregnant wife inside, not with kindness, not with protection, but with 19 enslaved people, 19 lives forced into submission, 19 bodies trapped in the bowels of a wooden coffin on ice. Your mind wants to rationalize it, to find some shred of explanation, some glimpse of morality. Stop. There is none. There is only control, only power. She begs. You can hear her voice even now, through the centuries, carried in the trembling winds that weave through the broken boards. She begs for more. More what, you wonder? Freedom. Mercy. No, more of the unspeakable. More of the cruelty that the master wields like a whip, like a scepter, like a secret that grants him dominion over life and death. And hey, in this barn, every plea, every heartbeat, every silent tear becomes part of a larger architecture of fear. You are watching the birth of obedience not through compassion but through terror. But here's the truth most historians will never tell you. This wasn't isolated. This was methodical, calculated, and it echoes across generations. Every lash, every locked door, every moment of silent suffering was not only punishment but training. Training for a mind that would learn to obey, to suppress instinct, to submit to the invisible hands that hold entire societies in quiet terror. This barn, these 19 souls, this woman, she is not just a footnote. She is a symbol, a mirror held up to a civilization built on the foundations of secret, systemic control. And now, you are complicit. Simply by witnessing it, you are stepping into the same hole of shadows. You can look away, but you know you won't. Something inside you recognizes the rhythm of control, the architecture of fear, the way power whispers and commands. By the end of this journey, the knowledge you gain will settle in your bones. It will awaken something primal and dangerous, the awareness that mankind has always been more cruel, more cunning, and more secretive than we allow ourselves to believe. This is not a story for the faint-hearted. It is a story for those who wish to see the machinery behind the veil, to understand not only what men do but why they do it, and how you can recognize the same forces trying to shape your mind today. And that, my friend, is where the real darkness begins. Before you understand what happened inside that barn, you must first understand the man who ordered it. Not the surface-level portrait painted in dusty books or curated museum plaques, but the truth, the kind that leaks through old court records, private letters, and the trembling testimonies of those who survived him. He wasn't a monster because of a single moment. He was a monster because he learned early that power is most effective when it is quiet, when it is disguised as righteousness, when it convinces everyone around it to doubt their own instincts. That is the oldest form of control known to man, the manipulation that doesn't break you immediately, but bends you slowly until you forget you were ever standing straight. He ran his plantation like a kingdom of shadows. Orders were whispered, never written. Punishments were orchestrated with precision. And his wife, young, pregnant, emotionally starved, was both his possession and his experiment. To the outside world, they were a respectable couple, but behind closed doors, he watched her mind fracture piece by piece, not with regret, but with fascination. He studied her like an alchemist searching for a new formula. How far could a human be pushed before obedience became devotion, before torment became dependence, before the victim asked for more? You have to understand, he didn't lock her in the barn as punishment. He locked her there to prove a theory. He believed fear could transform a person more effectively than love, more powerfully than faith, more permanently than any oath. He wanted to see what happened when isolation became ritual, when humiliation became normal, when the presence of enslaved people, stripped of their own dignity, became her only connection to the world. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography, a silent, methodical symphony of control. And what's more unsettling is this: the world around him allowed it. The authorities, the church, the neighbors, not because they approved, but because they feared the ripple effects of questioning a man with wealth and influence. Corruption doesn't always wear the face of cruelty. It often hides behind the comfort of silence, behind the lie that it's none of our concern. That silence is the most dangerous institution in history. It has buried more truths than any tyrant ever could. As you hear this, something inside you stays. A quiet unease. A recognition. Because you've seen this pattern before, haven't you? At work. In politics. In relationships. It's the same dark architecture. Isolate. Confuse. Degrade. Then dominate. The blueprint hasn't changed. Only the tools have. And the deeper we go, the more you will realize that the barn was not an anomaly. It was a prototype. A controlled environment for a much larger system of manipulation designed to shape societies, not just individuals. You're descending now. No turning back. Now, listen closely. The barn, the pregnant wife, the 19 enslaved people, they were all players in a theater of control far older than the 19th century. What you are witnessing is a ritualized exercise of power, a microcosm of human history itself. Men have built empires not merely through swords or money, but through invisible chains, psychological constructs so subtle that entire populations can be enslaved without ever feeling the weight. What happened in that barn is an echo of that eternal system. A test, a demonstration, a warning disguised as punishment. Inside that wooden coffin of shadows, every sound mattered. Every moan, every plea, every quiet shuffle of chains became a language of obedience and rebellion. She could feel it. The omnipresent gaze of someone who believed dominion was his birthright. He could see her breaking, piece by piece, and she could feel him calculating each moment, each shiver, each tear. What the world sees as cruelty is sometimes nothing more than the cold application of power science, a cruel, meticulous architecture that teaches submission as the ultimate lesson. The enslaved people were more than mere witnesses, they were instruments. Their presence amplified the terror, transformed the environment into a crucible where obedience became the only currency. And the pregnant wife, paradoxically, began to ask for more. Not because she wanted it, but because she was beginning to understand the rules of the system. Desire, fear, shame, and survival all coalesced into one inescapable equation. This is the psychology of domination, and it is older than any nation, any law, any morality. It is written into the marrow of civilization itself. Now, consider the implications. If fear can be harnessed to make a person beg for torment, what happens when these principles are scaled up? When entire societies are conditioned the same way, isolated by propaganda, surrounded by controlled narratives, trapped in invisible bonds of ideology. The lesson of the barn is not just about the cruelty of one man. It is about the mechanics of control, and how easily humans can become complicit in their own subjugation when every choice is manipulated. And here's the darkest part. This knowledge is dangerous because it changes the way you see yourself. You cannot look at obedience, power, or suffering the same way again. You start noticing patterns where others see randomness. You begin to sense the invisible architecture that bends society without anyone raising a hand. And that awareness, while frightening, is the first step toward mastery. Because the moment you recognize the machinery, you can choose not to be part of it. The deeper we go, the more you will see that history isn't written by chance. It is written by men who understand the barn, the chains, the whispers in the dark. And the further you descend, the more you realize, some lessons are meant to be hidden, because they can make a man dangerous. Very dangerous. By now, you should feel it. The weight settling in your chest, a quiet tension that grows heavier with each revelation. The barn was never just a barn. It was a laboratory. Every gesture, every command, every shadow that moved across the floorboards was a lesson in submission. And here's the crucial point. Submission is seductive. Once you see it, once you understand it, you begin to recognize its fingerprints everywhere, in families, in governments, in workplaces. Power always leaves traces, and those who wield it understand how to twist those traces into chains that are invisible but unbreakable. The pregnant wife and the enslaved people were trapped in a system of orchestrated terror, but what they were experiencing is not unique to their time. It's the same template that rulers, institutions, and secretive societies have applied for centuries. Isolate the individual, destabilize the mind, then assert dominance so absolute that resistance feels impossible. Look closely, and you'll see the pattern repeated in every corner of history, from the castles of Europe to the plantations of the Americas, from the halls of autocrats to the boardrooms of the modern world. Fear and obedience are the oldest currencies known to man. And here's what most people miss. Domination is never about brute force alone. Brute force is visible. It can be fought. True control is invisible. It is subtle. It whispers in the ears of the fearful. It plants seeds of doubt where confidence once grew. The man in the barn understood this. He didn't need to strike every moment. He needed the pregnant wife to internalize the fear, to co-opt it into her own psyche, to begin begging for more as if she had chosen her chains herself. That is the brilliance of psychological control. It transforms the victim into a willing participant. Do not let yourself be comforted by the thought that this is just history. These mechanisms are alive today. They operate through institutions, traditions, media, and social expectation. Every day, humans are subtly nudged into conformity, into submission, into fear, often without realizing that the same principles that ruled the barn still rule their lives. Awareness is your first defense. Recognition is your first weapon. If you ignore this, you risk being a passive participant in systems designed to manipulate you, just as the barn trained obedience centuries ago. Now, take a moment. Let it sink in. The barn, the pregnant wife, the 19 souls, they are mirrors. Mirrors that reflect what happens when fear is engineered, when cruelty is disguised as order, when humans are coerced to obey their own oppressors. This is not fiction. It is an anatomy of power, a blueprint of control, and a warning. And as you continue to follow, you will see that the barn is only the beginning. The true horror lies in understanding that what was learned there is echoed across generations, shaping society in ways that remain invisible, until now. Now, you must understand something that most people will never grasp. The barn was a microcosm of society itself. 19 enslaved people, a pregnant woman, a man wielding unchecked authority. It mirrors the structures of control that have governed human civilization for centuries. This wasn't chaos. This was a system deliberately designed, meticulously maintained, and brutally enforced. And systems like this are never built on force alone. They are built on secrecy, on lies, and on the careful orchestration of perception. What people see is never the truth. It is the curated story, the safest meant to distract from the machinery underneath. Consider the psychology at play. The man had created a hierarchy of fear. He, at the apex, held absolute power. His wife, ostensibly equal in social status, was subjugated because her body, her mind, and her will became tools to reinforce that power. The enslaved people, already dehumanized by society, became instruments in the manipulation, a chorus that amplified terror. Every movement, every glance, every suppressed scream worked together like clockwork, forming a feedback loop where domination reinforced itself. And here's the insidious part. This loop does not require brutality to continue once it is internalized. The mind begins to police itself, learning to fear, obey, and even crave the very structure that oppresses it. Think about the implications. If this pattern can happen in a barn in 1846, how much more subtly does it happen in modern society? Fear is no longer just physical. It is social, psychological, economic. Institutions today operate under the same principle: isolate the individual, control the narrative, create dependency, and cultivate obedience. The barn was a prototype, a laboratory experiment that reveals what happens when one human believes they have the right to control another completely. The lessons from that barn are not confined to history books. They are alive, embedded in structures that dictate how people live, wake, think, and even love. And yet, this knowledge is a weapon. Once you see the pattern, once you recognize the invisible architecture of control, you begin to perceive the invisible chains in your own life. You see how society trains compliance, masks coercion as routine, and manufactures consent. You see how people are manipulated into begging for more rules, more oversight, more restriction, as if it were their choice. The barn was not an anomaly. It was a lesson in human psychology, one that whispers to you now across time, asking, do you see the pattern? Can you break it before it ensnares you? By the end of this video, you will not be the same. That is intentional. Dangerous knowledge changes perception. It awakens the part of the mind that questions authority, that sees manipulation for what it is, that refuses to be complicit in its own subjugation. And as you descend further into this story, you will witness not just cruelty, but the invisible hand of control, guiding human behavior across generations, shaping civilization itself in silence. Here's the part that will unsettle you more than anything so far. The pregnant wife, trapped in that barn, begging for more. At first, it sounds incomprehensible. How can someone ask for more suffering? But this is where the mind bends under extreme conditions. Trauma, fear, and isolation do not just break a person, they rewire them. In the darkest crucible of human experience, desire and dread fuse. The mind begins to crave the very forces that oppress it. It is not masochism. It is survival. It is adaptation. It is the human psyche learning that compliance is safety, that submission is protection, that begging for more is a bargaining chip in a game that has no rules but fear itself. The enslaved people, too, became part of this psychological theater. Their presence was not only physical but symbolic. They embodied obedience and submission, reinforcing the woman's awareness that power is absolute and resistance is perilous. Every whisper, every glance, every small act of subservience amplified the psychological pressure. And here's the most insidious lesson. When humans are trapped in such systems, the lines between victim and participant blur. The oppressed can internalize the oppressor's logic, adopting it as a framework for their own survival. The barn, then, was not only a prison. It was a laboratory for creating compliance in the most intimate, terrifying ways imaginable. This pattern is ancient. Societies have always weaponized fear and desire, twisting human instincts into mechanisms of control. Kings and emperors, priests and philosophers, plantation owners and dictators, they all understand this paradox. To dominate completely, you must teach your subject to desire what you control. You must make them crave order, even when it is oppression. You must convince them that submission is liberation, even when it is chains. The barn was a microcosm of this principle, a small, brutal experiment that reflects the psychology of civilization itself. And now, listen closely, because this is where it becomes personal. You have been trained to obey too, not through whips or chains, but through information, social conditioning, expectation, and fear. You have been placed in your own modern barn, one where desires are manipulated, freedoms are curated, and your mind is quietly guided by invisible forces. The difference is, the moment you recognize this, you gain power. Awareness becomes a weapon. Knowledge becomes armor. Once you see the system, you are no longer entirely a part of it. So I ask you to do something now, here in this moment. Comment below, twice, the phrase, "I see the shadows." Commit to it. Not for me, not for the algorithm, but for yourself. It is a symbolic act, a lock-in of identity, a first step in recognizing the architecture of control and taking the first measure of dominion over it. Remember this, the barn is not just history. It is a warning. And the deeper you go, the more you will see that these forces are not relics. They are alive, working quietly, invisibly, and waiting for minds untrained to step into their patterns. The enslaved people in that barn were not just witnesses, they were instruments, carefully woven into the architecture of control. Every glance, every tremor, every forced act of submission reinforced the pregnant wife's psychological imprisonment. She saw them comply, and in that compliance, her mind absorbed the lesson. Defiance is isolated, obedience is rewarded, if only with the illusion of safety. This is the oldest trick of control. Use others' submission as a mirror to magnify fear, to make the individual question their own instincts, their own courage, their own moral compass. In that confined space, each human became a node in a network of manipulation. Power is not merely exerted, it is contagious. Fear spreads faster than fire. Despair spreads faster than truth. The master understood this intuitively. By controlling one, he influenced all. By controlling all, he controlled the mind of the one who might resist. And the pregnant wife, watching and listening, began to internalize the dynamic. Her pleas for more were not just surrender. They were an acknowledgement of the system, a submission to the invisible architecture that held her, the enslaved, and even the master himself in place. It is here that you must pay attention. Human beings are wired to mirror. We reflect the behaviors of those around us, consciously and unconsciously. Those reflections can reinforce obedience, magnify fear, and create cycles of domination that appear unstoppable. The barn is a textbook example, a concentrated study of psychological contagion. One person bends, others follow. One fear spreads, and suddenly, compliance becomes automatic. This is the principle behind every manipulation, from domestic abuse to corporate control to national propaganda campaigns. The pattern is universal, and it is terrifying in its efficiency. And yet, there is a hidden truth. Awareness is immunity. Once you recognize the system, you can see the invisible threads pulling at others and at yourself. You can discern when fear is being used to shape behavior, when desire is being twisted into compliance, when the natural instinct for autonomy is being undermined. Knowledge becomes a shield, a way to step outside the barn, even when physically confined, even when psychologically assaulted. And that is why the story of this barn is dangerous. It teaches you patterns that can liberate or consume, depending on how deeply you internalize them. Now, imagine scaling this principle across entire societies. Fear, observation, manipulation, internalized compliance, all amplified by networks of humans obedient to authority, convinced that submission is safety. The barn is not merely history. It is a lens to see the mechanics of civilization itself. Every whisper of power, every calculated act of control, every ritualized display of dominance echoes the same lesson learned that night. Obedience can be engineered, fear can be weaponized, and desire can be redirected toward the chains that bind it. The question now becomes yours. When you leave this story, when you see the world as it truly is, what will you do with that knowledge? Will you remain trapped in someone else's invisible barn, or will you use it to break free, truly, entirely, and dangerously? Now, listen carefully. The master's mind was not chaotic. It was a precise machine of calculation. Every act of cruelty, every punishment, every silent observation had purpose. He didn't strike blindly. He measured responses, adjusted variables, and watched the human psyche bend and twist under pressure. In his mind, the barn was an experiment, a controlled environment to test obedience, resilience, and the limits of human will. And here's the terrifying part. He was right. Human beings, when isolated and pressured, begin to behave in ways that seem unnatural, almost mechanical, as if they were instruments playing a pre-written score. He rationalized his acts not as evil, but as mastery. Every scream, every plea, every shadow in the corner was a data point. Every fear he induced, every moment of confusion he engineered, became a step in a systematic understanding of control. To him, the barn was both laboratory and classroom. The pregnant wife, the enslaved people, they were not fully human in this framework. They were variables, observations, proof of a theory that fear, isolation, and manipulation could bend human behavior with surgical precision. And in that belief, he found a perverse sense of righteousness. Think about that. This is the psychology of power that transcends centuries. Power doesn't need to justify itself to morality. It only needs to justify itself to effectiveness. Cruelty becomes strategy. Obedience becomes currency. Resistance is failure. The barn, in this context, is not merely an atrocity. It is a window into the mindset that has built empires, maintained hierarchies, and silently manipulated masses. Men like him do not see themselves as tyrants. They see themselves as scientists, as engineers of human behavior. And that perspective allows them to cross moral boundaries that would paralyze ordinary men. And here's where it gets personal for you. Because this system, this calculus of control, is not confined to the past. It is alive today. Corporations, governments, social systems, they all rely on similar principles. Isolate the individual, control perception, manipulate desire, and ensure compliance. The tools are subtler now, technology, media, surveillance, but the architecture is unchanged. The barn teaches you how obedience is cultivated and how fear becomes internalized, not just externally imposed. Once you understand it, you can see it everywhere. And once you see it, you can no longer be ignorant. So feel the gravity of this moment. The master's methods, terrifying and precise, are more than history. They are a blueprint. They are instructions for domination, stripped down to their purest essence. And now, by following this story, you are standing at the threshold of understanding that system. One step further, and you will begin to see how the same principles shape the minds, the choices, and the behaviors of people all around you, even your own. Now focus. The pregnant wife's mind is where the true horror begins, not in her body, not in her physical confinement, but in the way her mind becomes a battlefield. Fear is no longer external, it seeps inward. Every glance at the enslaved people, every shadow cast by the flickering lantern, every quiet footstep becomes a signal. Her psyche begins to calculate risk, weigh obedience against survival, and reprogram itself in real time. She starts to anticipate terror before it arrives, to crave the very approval that comes only through submission, to beg for more because her mind has learned that asking is safer than resisting. This is the psychological architecture of domination. The twisted genius of the master's method is that he doesn't need to strike constantly. The threat alone becomes a tool more effective than any whip. Her body reacts before her mind fully comprehends. Hormones spike. Fear rewires her instinct. Survival mechanisms override morality. And slowly, subtly, she begins to participate in her own subjugation, internalizing the rules of the bond, the hierarchy of fear, the rhythm of obedience. What begins as resistance mutates into complicity. What begins as pleading for mercy transforms into pleading for more control. And you must understand, this is not isolated to her experience. It is the principle behind every system of psychological domination. Isolated enough, observed closely enough, manipulated subtly enough, a person begins to betray their own instincts, their own freedom, and even their own empathy. The enslaved people's presence amplifies this effect. Her mind compares herself to them, rationalizes her suffering, and bends to the invisible calculus of power. The bond, in essence, teaches that human will is malleable, that morality is negotiable, and that desire can be redirected, even toward chains. Now imagine the scale of this principle beyond one bond. Families, white places, governments, religions, all institutions are bonds in their own right, engineered to elicit obedience, to normalize submission, to convert fear into compliance. The pregnant wife is no longer just a woman in a single moment in history. She is a symbol, a case study, a warning. Because the forces that shaped her experience are alive today, silently influencing how people think, behave, and choose. Awareness of this is the first step toward autonomy. Ignorance ensures continued enslavement, whether literal or psychological. So feel it, the suffocating pressure, the mental calculus, the transformation of instinct into submission. That is the mechanism of power. That is the lesson of the bond. And now, as you absorb this, you realize that history is not merely a collection of events, it is a manual. And reading it carefully, with awareness, gives you tools. Dangerous tools. Knowledge that can liberate or consume. The choice is yours. Before you go any deeper, you need to remind yourself of something crucial. The enslaved people in that bond were not passive pieces of the master's design. They were human, thinking, calculating, terrified, and yet resilient in ways the master could never fully understand. Every one of them had learned, over years of brutality, how to read danger before it struck, how to quiet their breathing to avoid attention, how to protect what little dignity remained without provoking the wrath of the man who owned their lives on paper and tried to own their minds in practice. Imagine their perspective. 19 souls, dragged into a scenario engineered not for their punishment alone, but for someone else's psychological breaking. They had seen horrors before. Families torn apart, bodies beaten, spirits crushed, but there was something different about being forced into that bond with the master's wife. Something calculated. Something cold. They understood immediately that this was not merely cruelty. It was spectacle. They were being used as instruments of fear. Pieces in a twisted experiment designed to unravel another human being. They could feel the design of it, even if they could not articulate it. They also knew this. Survival required silence, stillness, obedience that was not true obedience, but a mask, a performance that kept them alive long enough to see another dawn. They had learned how to hide resistance inside compliance, how to fold their rage into quiet gestures, how to shield each other with glances, small movements, and unspoken agreements. They communicated through subtleties the master would never understand. They protected each other in ways he would never detect. And in that bond, beneath the weight of terror, they were not merely victims. They were witnesses, strategists, and silent resistors navigating a battlefield with no weapons but their minds. Here lies the deeper truth. Oppressed people often understand power more clearly than the ones who wield it. They understand its rhythms, its patterns, its weaknesses. They know how to survive in its shadows, how to anticipate its blows, how to manipulate its blind spots. The master believed he was running an experiment, but he never realized he was being observed too. Studied by 19 minds sharpened by suffering, 19 souls who had learned to survive in a world engineered against them. And what they saw in that bond was not just cruelty. They saw the master's need for control, the fragility of his ego, the desperation behind his domination. They saw the cracks in him, the same cracks that exist in every tyrant, every manipulator, every authority who fears losing power more than anything else in the world. They saw weakness disguised as strength. And you must understand this, because it is a key revelation in the descent. The people who crave absolute control are always the most terrified. Terrified of disobedience. Terrified of chaos. Terrified of being exposed. Their cruelty is not confidence. It is panic wearing armor. When you recognize that, when you observe the architecture of power the way those 19 souls did, you begin to see the truth behind every system of domination, past and present. You understand that control is never as absolute as it appears. That even in the darkest rooms, the oppressed find ways to resist. And that the master, no matter how ruthless, is never untouchable. And that realization is more dangerous than anything he locked inside that barn. Now you must descend one layer deeper, into the part of the story that most historians avoid because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The master wasn't the only danger in that barn. The space itself, the walls, the smell of rotting wood, the thick heat of fear, began to shape the behavior of everyone inside. Environments can dominate as much as people do. The barn became a pressure chamber, a psychological crucible where instincts warped, where time felt distorted, where every breath carried the weight of uncertainty. The pregnant wife felt it first, but the enslaved people felt it too, just differently. Where she dissolved, they adapted. Where she trembled, they observed. Where she begged for more, they retreated into the mental armor that had kept them alive for years. The air was thick with dread, but also with calculation. 19 minds scanning the master's intentions, reading the wife's unraveling, searching for meaning in the brutality forced upon them. They were trapped, yes, but they were not blind. They recognized that the master was testing boundaries, probing for reactions, gauging the limits of psychological endurance. They could feel his gaze, even when he wasn't physically present. That was his greatest weapon, fear that traveled without footsteps, fear that clung to them like a second skin. And yet, silently, they resisted. Resistance, in their world, didn't look like rebellion. It wasn't fire or defiance or escape. It was survival. It was the ability to remain human when someone tried to turn you into an object. It was the quiet refusal to let your spirit fracture. It was protecting each other with small, almost invisible gestures, a whispered warning, a shared glance of encouragement, a deliberate act of stillness to keep attention off someone more vulnerable. These were acts of courage, though no history book would ever record them. These were rebellions, though no one outside that barn would ever understand their magnitude. And the master, he mistook their silence for submission. He believed that fear had conquered them entirely. But he didn't understand the resilience born from suffering, the kind of strength that comes not from privilege but from surviving the impossible. His experiment assumed they were passive instruments. But in truth, they were observers in ways he could never be. They saw him clearly, saw the desperation behind his cruelty, the insecurity behind his dominance, the unstable cracks behind the persona he projected. They knew what he didn't, that control built on fear cannot last, that domination fueled by insecurity will eventually collapse under its own weight. And this is where the lesson widens beyond that barn, beyond 1846, beyond history itself. Every system of control in society follows the same pattern. It thrives on silence, assumes obedience, and depends on the belief that the oppressed are blind. But the oppressed always see more clearly than the oppressor expects. They see the contradictions. They feel the weaknesses. They notice the fear behind the authority. And once that awareness exists, even quietly, even secretly, the structure of domination is already beginning to rot. This is the truth men rarely speak aloud. Those who appear powerless often understand power better than those who wield it. And those who suffer under tyranny often carry the knowledge that will one day dismantle it. The barn was a stage, yes, but it was also a lesson. A reminder that people forced into darkness can still see. That silence does not equal surrender. And that even in the deepest chambers of fear, the human spirit learns how to endure, how to watch, and how to wait. Because every tyrant falls. And every victim remembers. The days that followed were quieter on the surface, but the tension underneath had grown sharper, more concentrated. The master thought the barn had served its purpose, that he had demonstrated dominance, re-established fear, and broken any illusions of resistance. But what he failed to grasp was this: people do not break cleanly. They crack in ways that change them. They bend in ways that make them stronger. And sometimes the silence after brutality is not submission, it's transformation. Inside the house, his pregnant wife moved through the rooms like a ghost. She spoke little, slept poorly, and clutched her belly as though trying to protect her unborn child from something she couldn't name. But she knew. Her body knew. Her mind knew. The barn had injured something deeper than pride. It had damaged her trust in the world, in him, in herself. She kept replaying every scream, every sound, every shifting shadow. The violence had not awakened her. It had hollowed her. And the enslaved people, they lived with a different kind of silence. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of strategy. They shared almost no words about the incident, but each of them carried a sharpened awareness of the master's instability. His unpredictability had become a warning, a signal that the balance of their survival needed to be recalculated. Fear is dangerous. Yes, but unpredictable fear is far more deadly. It makes every step a negotiation, every gesture a risk. So they adapted again. They watched him more closely. They learned his rhythms. They learned the way his mood changed with weather, with alcohol, with the wife's exhaustion, with the crops, with the voices inside his own head. They mapped his volatility the way sailors map storms, never fully safe, but always prepared. What the master didn't realize was that his own insecurities had begun to expose him. His cruelty had crossed into excess, and excess reveals weakness. Excess reveals desperation. He had wanted to demonstrate power, but instead he revealed obsession, a need to assert control so aggressively that it showed he was losing it internally. That's the irony of domination. The moment it becomes overstated, it exposes its own decay. Meanwhile, the wife had started avoiding him, not openly, but subtly. She never refused him. That would have been impossible in their world. But she found excuses to rest, to visit her sister, to stay upstairs, to linger near windows where other people could see her. She had begun constructing a fragile perimeter around herself, the way someone cornered by an animal instinctively seeks higher ground. And although the master noticed her distance, he interpreted it through the narrow lens of his own ego. He thought she was simply emotional. He thought pregnancy was making her weak. He thought she was overwhelmed, delicate, irrational. He never once considered that she was afraid of him. And inside the slave quarters, something else was stirring. Not rebellion, not plotting, but awareness. A shift in how they read the household. A shift in how they interpreted every word from the master and every silence from the wife. They saw the fractures forming long before the people who caused them. They understood, in ways only the oppressed can understand, that the center of the house was starting to rot. It wasn't hope. Hope was dangerous. It wasn't victory. Victory was impossible. But it was something subtle, something quiet. The first sign that the master's world was beginning to tilt. And once a world begins to tilt, nothing stands the same way again. The turning point didn't come with a scream or a violent outburst. No, real shifts rarely announce themselves that way. Real shifts begin quietly, like a hairline fracture running through stone. Almost invisible at first, but unstoppable once it starts spreading. And in that house, in that year, in that poisoned atmosphere of fear and unspoken desperation, the fracture took the shape of a single night, one humid, airless evening when everything seemed normal on the surface, but absolutely nothing was. It began with a storm. Thick clouds rolled in just after sunset, swallowing the moon in a bruised purple haze. The air smelled like electricity, like metal, like something alive and watching. The wife felt it first, her skin prickling, her breathing tightening, her unborn child shifting anxiously inside her. Storms had always made her uneasy, but this time felt different. This time it felt personal, as if the sky itself were drawing closer to listen. She sat by the window, hands clasped over her belly, staring at the fields. The barn sat at the far edge of the property, a dark shape, half lit by distant lightning. The memory of that night inside its walls pulsed like a bruise. She could almost hear the faint echoes, the shifting bodies, the breath she tried so hard to hold. A part of her wanted to hide under blankets, but another part, some deeper instinct, wouldn't let her look away. Meanwhile, the enslaved people gathered in their quarters, huddled around the dim glow of a lantern. Storms made the master unpredictable, and unpredictability meant danger. They spoke in whispers, short and coded, their words shaped by necessity rather than trust. There was no plan, no rebellion forming, but something was happening among them, an alignment of perception. Each one of them sensed the same thing. The house was changing. The master's rage was no longer directed outward. It was beginning to collapse inward. And the master himself, he paced back and forth across the wooden floor, boots thudding with a rhythm that matched the distant thunder. He was restless, agitated, unable to settle. His thoughts circled the barn, circled the memory of his wife's pleading, circled the eyes of the enslaved people watching him that night. He told himself he was in control, but that's the first lie every tyrant tells himself before the fall. What he really felt was the slow, rising terror of a man whose authority has begun to slip through his fingers. He drank to silence the feeling. He shouted at the storm as if the sky would obey him. He paced harder, faster, trying to outrun the truth circling his mind. That fear had entered his house, and not theirs. His. The lightning struck so close the windows trembled. The wife flinched. The enslaved people went silent, and the master stopped pacing, staring into the dark hallway as if something was standing there, waiting. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a figure. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was simply the realization, the one every man tries to avoid his entire life, that once you lose the respect of those around you, power becomes nothing more than noise and force. And noise eventually fades, and force eventually breaks. The storm outside intensified, but the storm inside that house, that was only beginning. The storm didn't pass quickly. It sat over the land like a living thing, growling, shifting, waiting. Rain hammered the roof in heavy sheets, each impact echoing through the hollow spaces of the house. It was the kind of storm that made even the strongest men feel small, the kind that strips away arrogance and forces you to confront everything you've been trying to outrun. And on that night, with thunder shaking his windows and lightning splitting the sky like a warning, the master found himself face to face with a truth he had never prepared for. He stood at the edge of the hallway, staring toward the back rooms where his wife rested. In another moment, in another life, he might have gone to her. But fear had twisted their marriage into something unrecognizable. He could sense her distance. He could sense her silence. And though he'd never admit it, not even to himself, he feared her judgment more deeply than any threat outside those walls. Because she had seen him, truly seen him. Not the persona, not the master, not the wealthy landowner, but the raw, unmasked core of him inside that barn. And once someone sees the truth beneath a tyrant's mask, the tyrant is never the same. He swallowed hard, unable to shake the sense that his world was shrinking around him. Every creaking board sounded like a whisper. Every flicker of candlelight looked like movement. Every flash of lightning illuminated corners he didn't want illuminated. He slammed another shot of liquor to steady his nerves, but alcohol doesn't soften fear. It magnifies it. Meanwhile, the wife lay awake, staring at the ceiling as her child kicked beneath her ribs. Her breathing was shallow, her mind drifting between memories and instincts. The storm felt like a message she couldn't decipher. The barn felt like a wound that would never heal. She felt watched, but not by spirits, not by shadows, by consequences, by the truth that had entered her life through a door she never opened. She whispered to herself, "You have to be strong." But strength felt like a stranger now. Every moment since that night had stretched her thinner, more fragile. Yet something else was forming too, something hardening inside her, like iron being forged in secret. Fear had its limits, and she had reached hers. In the slave quarters, the air was thick and trembling. Rain seeped through cracked wood, thunder rolled like distant cannon fire, but no one complained. Hardship was familiar, storms were familiar, but the feeling among them was not familiar at all. They could sense the master's unraveling. Oppressed people always sense these things first. The shift in tone, the fracture in authority, the tremble behind the buck. They had lived long enough to know that when a man begins to lose control of himself, the danger to others rises. They prayed quietly, some for safety, some for strength, some simply to survive the next sunrise. But beneath the prayers there was another feeling, subtle, cautious, unspoken, the awareness that power in that house was beginning to tilt. Humans don't notice shifts in systems until the collapse is already underway. But those forced to live under that system, they feel the change the moment the first crack appears. And 19 enslaved souls felt it now. Deeply, clearly, precisely. As the storm roared on, the master felt smaller. His wife felt colder, and the enslaved people felt the early tremors of something long overdue. The house was holding its breath, and breath, once held too long, always breaks. By midnight, the storm had settled into a low, continuous rumble, like the earth was growling beneath the master's feet. The candles burned low, shadows stretched long across the floorboards, and the house felt colder than it should have. Not the cold of weather, but the cold of revelation, of truth pressing inward, squeezing the walls, tightening the air. The master sat in his study, elbows on the desk, fingers digging into his temples as if he could crush the thoughts swirling inside his skull. His liquor bottle lay half empty beside him, but even alcohol couldn't silence the truth anymore. He was losing control. Not of his property, not of his wife, not even of the enslaved people who lived under his command. He was losing control of himself. The one thing he had always feared. He lifted his head slowly, listening. The house creaked again, just with shifting under the pressure of rain, but it made his heart jump. Authority built on domination relies on one fragile illusion, that the oppressor is invincible. That illusion was cracking inside him now, splintering like glass under heat. And once that illusion cracks, everything else follows. He whispered into the empty room, "I'm still in control." But even his own voice didn't believe him. Upstairs, the wife reached over the edge of the bed and touched the floor as if grounding herself. Her breath was shaky, her eyes swollen. She had tried to sleep, but something inside her was awake, wide awake. Pregnancy heightens intuition, sharpens danger sense, makes a woman feel truths before they become visible. And tonight, her instinct screamed one thing: the house is no longer safe. Not because of ghosts, not because of storms, but because of the man walking its halls. She thought about leaving, about running to her sister's home a few miles away. But the roads were mud now, the night thick and merciless, and the master would never allow it. He saw her as an extension of himself, property with a pulse. Still, the desire to escape pulsed through her veins like fire. She placed a trembling hand over her stomach and whispered to her unborn child, "I won't let him break you, too." It was the first time she spoke aloud the truth she'd been afraid to admit. She was not just frightened for herself anymore. She was frightened of him. Frightened of what he might do next. Frightened of how far his unraveling might reach. In the slave quarters, the air was heavy with anticipation. An older man named Elias sat by the window, his eyes scanning the yard through flashes of lightning. He had lived under 6 different plantation owners in his lifetime. He had seen madness take hold before, seen the tremors in a man's behavior before violence erupted. And tonight, he felt that familiar tremor rising again. He whispered to the others, "He ain't right. Not tonight." And the room went still. No one asked questions. No one doubted him. They knew Elias didn't speak without cause. They trusted his instincts, instincts carved from decades of surviving men like the master. And his warning spread through the quarters like a pulse, bracing them for something they couldn't yet see but could almost feel moving toward them. It wasn't rebellion brewing. It wasn't hope, either. It was readiness, the readiness of people who know the storm outside is nothing compared to the storm inside the man who owns their lives. The house, the land, the barn, the fields, they all seemed to lean inward as the night deepened, as if listening, waiting for the moment when everything would shift. The kind of moment you don't see coming until it's too late. And that moment was close now, closer than any of them realized, closer than even the master feared. Because on nights like this, when a man's inner walls begin to crumble, the darkness inside him no longer asks for permission. It just rises. The first true breaking point came not from violence, but from silence, the kind of silence that enters a house like a presence, settles in the corners, and watches. The storm had calmed, but the world outside remained soaked and trembling. Water dripped from the eaves in slow, rhythmic taps. The trees stood motionless, stripped of wind, and the sky hung low and bruised, as if exhausted from warning them. Inside, the master sat motionless in his study, staring at the dying ember of a candle. His thoughts drifted through a fog of anger, shame, and a fear he refused to name. He told himself he was thinking, planning. But everyone knows this kind of stillness. It's not planning. It's the paralysis that comes when a man realizes he no longer controls the narrative of his own life. His wife's distance, the enslaved people's quiet watchfulness, the land's failing crops, the barn, the memory of her pleading, the knowledge that 19 souls witnessed his moment of greatest weakness. He clenched his jaw until he tasted metal. He hated the feeling of slipping power, hated the idea that anyone, his wife or the enslaved, might sense his doubt. In his world, men like him were allowed brutality, but never fragility. He could whip a man, chain him, starve him, break him, but he could never let them see him question himself. And now they had. Upstairs, the wife rose from bed and moved quietly toward the staircase. She held one hand against the wall as she descended, each step creaking beneath her. Her breath came slow but deliberate. She wasn't going to confront him. She wasn't going to plead. Something deeper was guiding her, a force born from survival, not emotion. She moved like someone who had made a decision she hadn't spoken yet. She stepped into the hallway and froze. The master was standing at the far end, half-shadowed, watching her. For a moment, neither spoke. Lightning flashed behind the windows, illuminating his face, hollow eyes, clenched jaw, veins rising like cords in his neck. She felt her stomach tighten around her unborn child, but she didn't step back. Fear no longer controlled her. Something sharper did. He broke the silence first. "You think I don't see it," he muttered. "You think I don't feel you slipping away from me?" She didn't answer. Her pulse hammered, but her gaze remained fixed on his. "You're my wife," he continued, voice trembling with an emotion he couldn't disguise, an emotion he hated, desperation. "This house, this land, everything stays in order because I keep it in order. And you," his voice cracked for a breath, "you don't get to judge me." Another flash of lightning. For a split second, he looked like a man standing in front of his own ghost. Down in the quarters, Elias stood suddenly from his cot. He didn't know why. He couldn't see the house. But something in his bones, a warning carved from decades of surviving white men's tempers, told him the master was about to cross a threshold inside himself. A threshold that once crossed could not be undone. Inside the house, the wife inhaled slowly. Her voice, when it finally came, was steady. "I'm not judging you," she whispered. "I'm surviving you." The word struck him harder than any blow. His face twitched, something between rage and heartbreak, and for a moment, the entire house seemed to lean forward, waiting to see which emotion would win. Because a man in that state is a loaded weapon, not guided by logic, not guided by love, guided only by whatever darkness rises fastest. And his darkness was rising now. The master didn't explode at first. Men like him rarely do. The most dangerous rage is not the kind that bursts, it's the kind that tightens, coils, and simmers until it becomes something else entirely. Something colder, something calculated, something that no longer looks like anger, but like purpose. Her words, "I'm surviving you," echoed in his skull like a gunshot. Not shouted, not emotional, just true. And truth, when spoken to a man whose identity relies on control, feels like a blade pressed against the throat. His jaw tightened, his breathing slowed, and the silence stretched until the air felt too thin to inhale. "You think you understand survival," he said quietly, stepping closer. "Survival is what I give you, what I give them. Without me, none of this stands." It was a lie he believed with religious devotion, that his power was order, that his cruelty was stability, that he was the foundation rather than the rot. Men built on domination always convince themselves that they are the reason others breathe. She didn't respond. Silence was the only power she had left, the only thing that didn't feed him. And that silence infuriated him. He stepped closer, boots thudding against the floorboards, echoing through the hollow house. His wife stayed still. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was terrified. But she understood something in that moment. The more she backed away, the more he advanced. Fear fed him. Retreat emboldened him. She had no weapons, no escape, but she had a truth he could not erase. And for the first time, she realized the truth wounded him more than submission ever could. Down in the quarters, Elias felt the shift again. Sharp, jarring, unmistakable. He stood so abruptly his cot scraped against the floor. Several heads turned toward him. "What is it?" whispered a young man. Elias didn't blink. His losing himself tonight. They went silent. They knew what that meant. They had lived through nights when the master's fear turned outward, when he used violence to remind himself he still owned something, controlled something, dominated something. They had the scars to prove it. Inside the house, the master's voice lowered to a dangerous calm. "You think what happened in that barn broke you," he said. "But it broke nothing. It only reminded you of your place." Her hand involuntarily pressed against her belly. He noticed, and something inside him twisted. "You carry my child," he said, "and you will raise him under my rules, my order, my way. I won't have a son born into weakness because his mother forgets who keeps this family standing." Lightning flared outside, illuminating both of them, the master's trembling jaw, the wife's pale face, the silent war happening between their breaths. She exhaled slowly, and for the first time since that night in the barn, she spoke without fear. "Your son will see what you truly are," she whispered, "and that will break him more than anything else." His face contorted. Not with rage. Rage is honest. This was something else. A man confronting the realization that his legacy, his bloodline, his name might not worship him, but reject him. Men like him can't survive that thought. He stepped closer. Too close. And without raising his voice, without lifting a hand, he said words that felt heavier than any strike. "You forget your place. Tonight, I will remind you." In the quarters, Elias felt it like a thunderclap. "It started," he whispered. Everyone stood. No one moved toward the house. They couldn't. But each of them felt the same icy truth settle into their bones. Whatever was coming next would change the future of that household forever. The moment he said those words, "Tonight, I will remind you," the house itself seemed to freeze. Not a ghostly chill. Not superstition. It was the kind of stillness that follows a predator's decision, the kind that makes instinct scream before the mind understands why. His wife's breast faltered. Her body shifted just slightly, as if preparing to run, even though she knew there was nowhere to run to. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching long behind him. His expression wasn't loud, wasn't violent, wasn't wild. It was worse. Calm, resolved, deliberate. The expression of a man who believed he was entitled to reshape reality to fit his will. The expression of someone who believed dominance wasn't an act, but a birthright. "Look at me," he said. She didn't. Not because of disobedience. She simply couldn't. Fear tightened every muscle in her neck, every thought in her mind. But he reached out, gripping her chin, trying to force her gaze upward. His fingers were cold. His touch was iron. "You're my wife," he whispered, "and I don't care how you feel. You will not pull away from me." Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs, but something inside her resisted, not with strength, not with defiance, but with clarity. She finally understood something she tried for months to avoid. He wasn't trying to restore order. He wasn't trying to mend their marriage. He wasn't trying to reclaim his authority. He was trying to break what remained of his spirit. And that realization did something unexpected. It didn't make her collapse. It didn't make her beg. It made her still. Still in a way that frightened him. Men like him recognize physical resistance. They know how to crush it. But stillness. Stillness is harder to read, harder to predict, harder to dominate. Stillness makes room for truth to gather its strength. He tightened his grip. "Don't make me teach you again." Lightning flashed outside the window, illuminating his face. Strained, fragile, trembling beneath the surface. He didn't look powerful in that moment. He looked terrified. Terrified of losing the illusion he'd built his entire life upon. And the enslaved people in the quarters felt that same shift at the exact same time. Elias closed his eyes, sensing the energy in the night twisting tighter, sharper. His reach in the point of no return, Elias said quietly. No one had to ask what he meant. In the house, the wife swallowed hard. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. "You can hurt me," she whispered. "You can control this house, but you cannot control who I become inside my own mind." His expression cracked. Pain first, then fury. Control was slipping. And he felt it. And she knew it. The storm outside had weakened. But the storm inside that man was about to tear something open. And once it did, nothing in that house, living or unborn, would ever be the same. The moment her words sank in, "You cannot control who I become inside my own mind," something inside him snapped. Not loudly. Not violently. More like a thread pulled too tight for too long, finally giving way with a sound no one else could hear. His hand dropped from her chin, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. His eyes darted across her face like he was searching for something he had lost: respect, fear, compliance, anything. But he found nothing. She stood there in front of him, weary and trembling, but unbroken. And that terrified him more than anything else she could have done. A man whose power is built on domination can survive resistance. What he cannot survive is indifference. A woman who no longer fears him is a threat he has no weapon for. He stepped back. Just an inch. But she noticed. And so did he. That inch was the first retreat he'd ever made in her presence. It burned him. It humiliated him. It destabilized everything he believed about himself. He turned away from her sharply, jaw clenched, hands curled into fists as he stormed toward the back door. He needed air. He needed space. He needed to escape the truth she had just carved into him. She remained frozen in place, her breath trembling in her throat. A part of her expected him to retain immediately, dragging the storm back inside with him. But he didn't. The door slammed open. Rain-soaked air blasted into the hallway. His boots stumped off the porch and toward the yard. In the quarters, Elias felt the shift again. Not a rise, but a rupture. "He ain't in the house no more," Elias murmured. "He's heading for the barn." Those words sent a chill through the room. Everyone knew what that meant. The barn wasn't just a building. It was the place where he proved his power, where he convinced himself he still ruled the world, where he tried to erase his insecurities by forcing the world to kneel. And tonight, he was going back. Not for them. Not for chores. Not for the land. He was going back to reclaim the version of himself he had lost. And that made the barn the most dangerous place on the entire property. Out in the rain, he marched across the yard, water splashing under his boots, thunder rolling behind him like an echo of his heartbeat. His breathing was ragged. His mind raced, feeding him the lies he needed to restore the illusion he was losing. She's weak. She's emotional. She's ungrateful. She needs to remember who controls this land. Who controls her. Who sets the order. The barn came into view, its dark silhouette rising from the wet earth like a monument to the worst parts of him. He reached for the latch, fingers shaking from cold or fury or both, and yanked the door open. Inside, the 19 enslaved people looked up. They had gathered there to escape the leaky quarters during the storm, huddled around a single lantern. They froze when they saw him silhouetted in the doorway, rain dripping from his clothes, eyes hollow and burning. A silence thick as smoke filled the room. They knew that look. They had seen it on other men. Men who lost control of their own minds and came looking for someone else to break. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. His voice came out low, strained, dangerous. "All of you, stand." Slowly, cautiously, they rose. Not because they obeyed, but because survival demanded it. Outside, the rain softened into a mist. Inside the house, the wife sank to her knees, clutching her belly. Something in her told her exactly where he had gone, and she whispered, "Please, no," though there was no one to hear it but the unborn child pressing against her ribs. In the barn, the lantern flickered. The master inhaled deeply, preparing to speak again, preparing to reassert himself, to rebuild the illusion, to reclaim the fear he believed belonged to him. But the 19 souls watching him had changed. They were no longer the same people he had marched into that barn weeks earlier. They carried a different kind of silence now. A silence that didn't tremble. A silence that didn't bow. A silence that said, "We have survived worse than you." He felt it. He felt their eyes. He felt their unspoken judgment, quiet but unyielding. And for the first time in his life, it wasn't them he wanted to break. It was himself he needed to prove something to. And that made him unpredictable in a way none of them could afford to misjudge. The barn smelled of damp wood, sweat, and fear. But the fear in the air tonight was not uniform. It had changed, transformed into something subtle but sharp, a tension born not of submission, but of awareness. The 19 enslaved people, once passive instruments of his control, now held a quiet power. They knew the terrain. They knew the man who thought he ruled them. And most importantly, they had watched how he faltered in front of his wife. That faltering had changed everything. The master stood in the center of the barn, chest heaving, eyes darting. He looked around at the faces illuminated by the flickering lantern, faces he once owned with terror alone. But tonight, those faces were different. No trembling, no pleading, no desperation, only measured observation, only restraint, only the kind of patience born from surviving decades of cruelty. Every movement, every flick of an eye, every breath was a silent statement. We are alive. We endure. We remember. He tried to impose the old rules, the rules that had governed this house for years. Stand straight. Obey. Do as I say. The words left his mouth like iron chains, but the weight behind them was hollow. He had spoken them 1,000 times, and each time they had worked. But tonight, something was different. He felt it immediately. Compliance had evaporated. Obedience was no longer automatic. The illusion of control, the thing he had built with cruelty, fear, and intimidation, was cracking in real time before his eyes. The wife's presence lingered, even though she was elsewhere. Her defiance, subtle but unmistakable, had infiltrated the barn without entering it. Her refusal to yield to terror had awakened something inside those enslaved people, something older than fear. Clarity. They were no longer reacting to punishment. They were calculating, observing, waiting. This was a transformation the master couldn't anticipate, couldn't control, and couldn't undo. He clenched his fists. He tried again, harder this time. Commands, threats, the remnants of his rage, all hurled into the room like weapons. But each one was deflected by a calm no one had taught them, a silence no whip had carved. For the first time, the master realized that power built on terror is fragile. Fragile and deceptive. He had relied on fear alone for decades, but fear alone can be learned, can be endured, can be resisted. And tonight, they had endured. And here's the crucial point, the one that history hides because it undermines the myth of absolute authority. The barn was no longer his. Not fully. The space that had been a monument to his power, where he had humiliated and broken others, had become a mirror reflecting his own weakness, his own unraveling, his own dependency on compliance to feel whole. Every step he took in that barn reminded him that dominance is a fragile illusion, and once a mind learns not to fear you, your dominance dissolves like smoke in the wind. This is the hidden lesson of every system of oppression, every tyrant, every empire built on submission. The moment the oppressed see the truth, the moment they internalize awareness, the balance of power shifts quietly but irreversibly. And the master in the barn that night, so sure of himself, so insulated in cruelty, felt that shift in a way no one else could explain. Because he was losing control over the one thing he never realized controlled him, perception. And perception, once lost, cannot be reclaimed. The night stretched, heavy and unrelenting, as if time itself had slowed to observe the unraveling. The master's breath fogged the air, uneven and shallow. He tried to ground himself, to reassert authority through the mere act of presence. But presence is only power when it is acknowledged. Tonight, his presence was noticed, but not obeyed. That distinction, subtle and deadly, gnawed at the foundations of his mind. He paced the barn floor, boots pressing into damp earth, eyes darting at shadows as if the walls themselves might rise against him. The enslaved people remained where they were, silent but unblinking. Their endurance was a weapon he had never accounted for. Each measured glance, each subtle shift of weight, whispered, "We know. We are awake." And when people know, when they truly see, the tyrant's illusions crumble from the inside. The pregnant wife, though not physically present, had cast a shadow across this moment. Her refusal to submit, her defiance framed in quiet dignity, had become contagious. Fear was no longer automatic. Obedience was no longer guaranteed. Even the master could feel it. Something fundamental had shifted in the energy of the household, in the psychology of those he once controlled. He slammed his fist against a wooden beam, a sound that echoed through the barn like the strike of a gavel. But it was empty. It was anger without effect, rage without consequence. The realization began to claw at him. He had relied on terror to maintain control, and terror had limits. Once the observed recognize the structure, once they read the system, the fear that underpinned it becomes useless. The illusion fractures. The hierarchy collapses. And what remains is raw truth. And what is truth? The truth is that domination is never absolute. It is conditional, fragile, dependent on the perception of those being dominated. The master had ruled through terror for decades, never once considering that those under his command might internalize their own awareness. He had treated them as passive instruments, tools in his psychological experiment. Yet now, faced with their measured silence, he saw his error. They were not passive. They were witnesses, strategists, keepers of memory, and the barn itself had become a crucible for insight rather than fear. Every tyrant in history, whether king, general, plantation owner, or CEO, relies on the assumption that fear is permanent. But the moment fear is interpreted, analyzed, endured, and transformed, the equation changes. The barn was no longer a cage. It was a mirror reflecting the master's vulnerability. And the realization of vulnerability is more dangerous than any whip, any punishment, any threat he had ever wielded. The storm outside had long since passed, leaving the night still and heavy, a quiet stage for the collapse of illusions. The master's mind raced, trying to anticipate resistance he could not see, attempting to command obedience that had evaporated. He could no longer rely on brute force or terror. And in that clarity, he felt something unfamiliar, something that made his pulse tighten. Loss of control. It is a feeling every man fears, a truth every tyrant hides from himself, and a moment every enslaved person recognizes immediately. The barn was no longer his. The night was no longer silent. And history, if one listened carefully, was watching. By the early hours, the barn had transformed from a site of terror into a theater of reckoning. Every creak of the wooden beams, every flicker of lantern light, felt charged with a new energy. A tension that could snap at any moment. The master, once confident and commanding, now moved like a man navigating unfamiliar terrain. The authority he had wielded for decades had begun to erode under the weight of perception. And perception, as he was learning too late, was not his to command. The enslaved people had shifted too. They were no longer simply surviving, they were observing with a level of awareness that made him unpredictable. Every subtle gesture, every blink, every shift of their weight was an assessment, a calculation. They were reading him the way he had read them for years, and in doing so, they reclaimed a fraction of their agency. The barn had become a crucible of human psychology, a place where power was being redefined with each heartbeat. He tried to impose order, speaking in clipped, precise tones meant to cut through the silence like a whip. But his words carried no weight. Obedience requires belief, and belief requires either fear or respect. He had burned the bridge to fear that night, and respect had never existed. His voice now felt hollow even to him, echoing off the walls without traction. He was speaking into a void created by his own cruelty. The pregnant wife's influence remained a specter in the room. Her defiance had infiltrated the consciousness of those inside, a quiet contagion. She had survived him once and, through her endurance, taught them an essential truth. That fear could be resisted, that the mind could remain sovereign even when the body was confined. And now, in the barn, they were internalizing that lesson, strengthening their resolve in ways that were invisible, almost imperceptible, but lethal to the illusion of control. The master's eyes darted from figure to figure. Every one of the 19 held themselves differently. Not in fear, not in anger, but in measured calculation. They were prepared. Prepared not to strike, not to confront directly, but to endure, to survive, and to witness. That preparedness is a force more formidable than brute strength because it is patient, invisible, and unshakable. He sensed it, and with that sense came a creeping panic, a subtle, corrosive realization that the world he thought he commanded was no longer tethered to him. And in that moment, the barn became a psychological battlefield. The master's dominance, once absolute, was now being measured, analyzed, resisted. His authority had shifted from physical enforcement to precarious negotiation with a mind he could no longer bend. The people around him, the same ones who had once trembled, now observed silently, waiting for the storm within him to reach its peak. History rarely captures such moments, the exact point when power begins to unravel, when the oppressor realizes that the oppressed have become impervious to fear. Yet this moment, heavy, silent, electric, was exactly that. A turning point in human understanding of control, resilience, and psychological endurance. The master's empire of terror was cracking. Slowly, quietly, irrevocably. And every breath in that barn carried the weight of that truth. Time stretched thin in the barn, each second dragging with unbearable intensity. The master's pulse pounded in his ears, a relentless metronome that seemed to synchronize with the soft shuffling and measured breathing of those around him. Every instinct he had relied upon for decades, instincts honed through fear, domination, and meticulous control, now failed him. The barn was no longer a place where he dictated reality. It had become a chamber where reality dictated him. He attempted once more to assert dominance, his voice slicing the silence with sharp commands. Sit. Kneel. Do not look at me. Words he had used countless times, intended to bend bodies and minds, now fell flat, like echoes in an empty tomb. The enslaved people remained upright, their eyes steady, their posture deliberate. There was no disobedience, only calculated endurance, a quiet power that carried the weight of experience and observation. They were no longer merely surviving. They were watching, and watching, in that moment, was more formidable than any act of compliance could have been. The master's hand twitched. A muscle jerked involuntarily in his jaw. He realized, with a growing sense of horror, that his control had become performative. He could still act the tyrant. He could still yell, threaten, posture, but he no longer owned the inner landscape of those he ruled. And in that revelation lay a terror far deeper than any whip or lash. Power without perception is meaningless. The illusion was crumbling from within, and no amount of outward aggression could repair it. Meanwhile, the pregnant wife remained outside the barn, watching from a distance, her pulse steady but her mind racing. She understood the dynamics unfolding inside better than anyone. Her own survival, and the survival of her child, depended not on confrontation but on patience, on understanding the fracture forming in the master's psyche. She had seen fear redirect behavior before. She had seen resilience take root in the most oppressed. And now, she waited, knowing that the balance of power inside the barn was tipping quietly, but irrevocably. Inside, the enslaved people subtly shifted their stance, a slight realignment that would go unnoticed by an untrained eye but was a deliberate signal to each other. Observe, endure, and remember. They knew the master's limits. They knew the vulnerabilities that decades of abuse could never erase. And as the minutes stretched, a slow, almost imperceptible confidence settled among them, a shared understanding that the man who had ruled through terror was now navigating uncertainty, exposed in ways he had never imagined. The barn itself seemed to hum with the weight of unspoken truths. Wooden beams bore witness to decades of cruelty, now vibrating with the tension of a mind unraveling under the weight of its own construction. Every shadow seemed to elongate, every creaking board became a subtle signal, every lantern flicker a silent message. The master could command fear, but he could not command awareness. And awareness, once awakened, becomes unstoppable. The storm had passed outside, but inside, a tempest was building, silent, invisible, relentless. One that would not be quelled by dominance, by rage, or by authority. And for the first time in his life, the master realized something terrifying. He was no longer the master of anything that truly mattered. The master's breathing grew shallow. He had lived decades believing that fear was currency, that obedience was proof of supremacy, that silence was proof of submission. Tonight, all of that was unraveling. The barn, once a stage of domination, had transformed into a theater of revelation. Every glance from the 19 eyes that now measured him spoke volumes he could not command, could not silence, could not erase. He tried reasoning next, a tactic he rarely used. His voice dropped to a calmer, almost conciliatory tone. "You know I give you life," he said. "You know the rules." But reason was a language they had learned to speak fluently in defiance. They understood survival was not dependent on his logic. Survival had its own language, one built on observation, endurance, and the internal strength he could never touch. The words he uttered were hollow vessels. The fear they once carried had dissolved like mist. Outside, the wife listened through the cracks of the barn's walls. She had learned the language of control without witnessing its execution directly. How subtle shifts in posture and glance could reveal the balance of power in ways most would never see. She understood that the enslaved people were no longer reacting to his tyranny. They were orchestrating their own form of resistance through stillness, through awareness, through mental fortitude. And with each passing moment, she realized the power of her own influence. By refusing to yield, by surviving herself, she had sparked a quiet revolution inside the barn without setting foot in it. The master, growing increasingly agitated, moved among them, testing the limits he had once dictated. Commands, threats, even insinuations of violence, all met with measured calm. He had become a man untethered from the illusion that once defined him. And in that untethering, panic began to seed itself. Panic is more subtle than fear, yet far more dangerous. It infiltrates thought, erodes certainty, and leaves a man exposed, vulnerable not to the bodies around him, but to the truths he refuses to see. The barn had become a crucible of psychology. Not cruelty, not compliance, but understanding. The enslaved people, watching him with patience and awareness, held a mirror to every flaw he had worked to conceal. He could strike, threaten, even rage, but they were no longer instruments of his control. They were witnesses, scholars of his unraveling, guardians of a quiet power that he could never reclaim. He could feel it, though he lacked the words to name it, the first real taste of impotence in decades. Authority is a construct, and he had built his life believing it was absolute. But constructs collapse when those bound by them refuse to play the game. And tonight, inside that barn, the illusion had fractured. His supremacy was nothing more than a brittle shell, waiting to crack under the weight of awareness. The barn had become the birthplace of a different kind of power, silent, measured, enduring. And the master, for the first time in his life, realized that fear alone is never enough to maintain control. The night deepened, and with it, the subtle shift in the barn became almost tangible. The master's movements were no longer guided by authority but by instinct, instinct honed through decades of dominance, yet faltering under the weight of realization. Every step he took, every gesture he made, was met with calm scrutiny, a measured endurance that spoke louder than obedience ever could. They were no longer responding to fear. They were observing, absorbing, calculating. The pregnant wife, still outside, felt the shift reverberate through the property. She knew instinctively that the barn had changed hands, not physically, not through force, but through understanding. The 19 had learned what he had never taught them, that survival was more than submission, more than fear. Survival was awareness, endurance, and the patience to let the truth rise naturally. Through her quiet defiance, she had planted a seed inside the barn. That seed had grown roots, and now, it was shaping the power structure in ways he could not predict. Inside, the master's voice grew tighter, strained with frustration. "You will respect my authority," he said. Words that once struck fear now hovered in the air like paper in a storm, fragile, easily disregarded. His hands twitched at his sides, fists clenching and unclenching as he wrestled with the internal collapse he could neither name nor stop. He had built his identity on control, and control was slipping through his fingers like water. He was left with nothing but the illusion of power, and illusions are brittle, easily shattered. The enslaved people remained composed, silent, unblinking. Each knew the stakes without speaking a word. They understood that the moment he realized the extent of his own unraveling, he would make a critical error, because no tyrant, when confronted with his own fragility, behaves rationally. Their silence was their strength. It was a strategy born from decades of observation, patience, and endurance. Every subtle movement, every exchange of glances, every measured shift in posture carried unspoken communication, an understanding that fear was no longer the currency of survival. And the master, sensing this, grew desperate. Desperation is a dangerous companion, more corrosive than any whip, more unpredictable than any storm. It feeds on pride, ego, and the illusion of control. And in desperation, he was no longer the man who had ruled this house with certainty. He was exposed, naked in the barn, forced to confront a truth he had long suppressed, that fear alone cannot sustain dominance when awareness awakens. Outside, the wife whispered to the unborn child, "Watch, learn, survive." Words meant for no one but the life she carried, but words that mirrored the lesson unfolding inside the barn. The barn had become a crucible, a place where the oppressed were no longer defined by his tyranny but by their own awareness and resilience. And the master, standing among them, finally understood something he could not undo. Power is nothing without perception, and perception is never owned by the oppressor. The storm had passed outside, but inside, a far greater tempest was brewing, one that would leave the barn forever changed, and all who entered it irrevocably marked. The first light of dawn crept across the horizon, pale and hesitant, but it carried with it a weight heavier than the night that had passed. Inside the barn, the air had shifted completely. The master, once towering with imagined omnipotence, now moved like a man trapped inside his own skin, acutely aware of the fragility of the world he had built on Fae. He could strike, he could shout, he could attempt to dominate, but none of it would restore what had been lost. The enslaved people, silent and poised, understood this instinctively. They had lived their entire lives navigating the cruel calculus of power, and in that silence, they now held leverage the master could not grasp: patience, endurance, and an unshakable awareness of his unraveling. The barn, once a theater of submission, had become a school of perception. Every creaking beam, every drip of water, every flicker of lantern light taught a lesson the master could no longer counteract. Awareness is stronger than Fae. He shifted his weight, hands trembling subtly, as if trying to summon the authority that had vanished. But it was gone. All the control he had relied on, all the dominance he had wielded, had become a hollow echo. He was confronted not by rebellion, not by violence, but by something far more terrifying: reflection. The barn mirrored his fragility, his insecurities, the cracks in his identity that he had hidden behind cruelty. And in this mirror, there was no escape. Outside, the wife watched from the edge of the property, rain still clinging to the trees, mud soft beneath her feet. She understood the significance of the moment unfolding inside. Her own survival, and the survival of the child she carried, had shifted the balance. Through her endurance, her refusal to submit, she had unwittingly taught the enslaved people inside the barn to see clearly, to observe, to resist, to endure mentally even while constrained physically. She had sparked a quiet revolution of perception. The master's voice, when it returned, was softer, strained, uncertain. "You will remember who I am," he said, but the words had lost their power. They hung in the air, unacknowledged, ineffective. In desperation, he moved closer, attempting to reassert dominance through presence, but presence alone cannot command minds that have already awakened. His gestures, once decisive, now trembled. His eyes, once sharp, now flickered with uncertainty. The barn itself seemed alive with the weight of history, the collective memory of oppression, endurance, and resilience. Every shadow, every beam, every grain of earth in the floor carried the lesson that power built on fear is temporary. The storm outside had passed, but inside, a far more permanent tempest raged, a mental, psychological, and emotional upheaval that would define the lives of everyone in that barn forever. And as the master faltered, a truth crystallized for all who witnessed it. True control resides not in cruelty, but in awareness, and awareness cannot be owned, only awakened. By mid-morning, the barn had become a place of quiet reckoning. The master's movements had slowed, weighed down by the invisible chains of his own fear and uncertainty. Every glance he cast across the 19 faces revealed a truth he could not bear. The power he had relied upon for decades was no longer absolute. He had ruled through terror, but terror could not govern minds awakened to perception. And in that awakening, the enslaved people had discovered something that could never be taken from them: clarity. The pregnant wife watched from a distance, unseen but intimately connected to the unfolding reality. Her influence was subtle, invisible, yet it radiated through every posture, every measured breath, every unflinching stare inside the barn. Her survival, her refusal to yield, had become a template for resistance. She had taught them without speaking a word: the body can be confined, but the mind remains sovereign. And as they internalized that lesson, the barn ceased to be a place of fear and became a chamber of quiet empowerment. The master tried once more to assert control, his voice low and commanding. "Obey me," he said. "Do not test me." But obedience is a contract, a fragile agreement that must be acknowledged by both parties. Tonight, that acknowledgement no longer existed. Every measure of authority he had relied upon, intimidation, threats, posturing, had been rendered ineffective by a subtle, powerful force he could not see: enduring awareness. And with every failed attempt, his own anxiety grew, feeding itself like a predator, undermining the very foundation of his identity. Inside the barn, the 19 moved with careful precision, communicating through imperceptible cues honed over years of survival. Each shift of weight, each blink, each quiet exhale carried unspoken information. They were not plotting rebellion in the conventional sense, but they were reclaiming power through perception, endurance, and unity. This was resistance in its most potent form: invisible, methodical, and irreversible. and the master, despite every effort, could neither predict nor control it. The psychological tension reached a crescendo, not with shouting or violence, but with stillness. Silence, once his ally, had betrayed him. The stillness of those watching, the calm endurance in the air, became a mirror reflecting his deepest fears. The barn was no longer a chamber of terror. It was a tribunal of perception, and he was on trial. Every twitch of muscle, every strain of his voice, every flicker of the eye was recorded by minds unclouded by fear. And somewhere in that crucible of quiet power, a lesson was written that night in indelible ink. Tyranny can dominate bodies, but perception governs minds. And once the mind awakens, no whip, no threat, no legacy of cruelty can bind it. The master's empire of fear was crumbling, not through force, not through resistance, but through the awakening of awareness, inside the barn, inside his wife, and inside the 19 who had endured far more than he ever understood. By late morning, the barn had settled into a fragile equilibrium, one built not on fear, but on observation, endurance, and the subtle reclamation of agency. The master stood at the center, soaked, trembling, trying to reassert the authority that had been his entire identity. But it was hollow now. Every gesture, every word, every command was met with a quiet, measured resistance that he could neither anticipate nor dominate. He realized, viscerally, that the very structure of power he had relied on for decades was no longer his. The pregnant wife remained hidden outside, rain-damp hair plastered to her cheeks, heart pounding. She had watched him falter before, but tonight she understood something deeper. True influence was not in confrontation, but in enduring, in awakening the consciousness of those around you. Through her defiance, she had empowered the enslaved people inside the barn to reclaim perception, to rise mentally even while physically constrained. She had sparked a transformation invisible to the world but devastatingly potent in its effect. Inside the barn, the 19 were no longer a group of frightened individuals. They were a cohesive force of awareness. Every glance exchanged, every subtle shift in posture, every measured breath, was a negotiation of power without words. They had learned that survival was not in submission, but in perception. The master could threaten, he could posture, he could attempt to dominate, but he could no longer control what he could not see. Their minds, their awareness, their resolve. The master's anger simmered, a dangerous, silent thing. Rage is an instinct that can be weaponized, but desperation is a different force. It consumes, erodes, and blinds. He realized that no amount of aggression could restore the illusion he had built. He was forced to confront the truth he had avoided his entire life. Domination is conditional, fear is temporary, and awareness is sovereign. The barn itself seemed to absorb the tension, the history of cruelty mingling with the present awareness, vibrating through the beams, the floorboards, and the walls. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within him, inside that man who had believed himself absolute, raged unchecked. And the 19 souls, quietly watching, had become witnesses to the collapse of tyranny, observing not just his actions, but the unraveling of his identity. And in that crucible of observation, endurance, and awakening, a timeless truth emerged, one hidden in plain sight through every era of oppression. Those who live under tyranny have more power than the tyrant ever realizes, for the mind cannot be owned, only awakened. The master understood it now. Too late. And in that understanding, the balance of the household, of the barn, and of every life tethered to that farm had irrevocably shifted. The sun rose fully now, pale light spilling across the fields, illuminating the barn in stark clarity. The master stood there, drenched and exhausted, finally seeing himself as he truly was. Not the invincible tyrant of his own imagination, but a man stripped bare by the truth of his dependence on fear. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, now flickered with panic and disbelief. He had built an empire of control, yet it all hung on perception, and perception, he now realized, could not be forced. Inside the barn, the 19 held their positions, poised and calm. Their silence was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if the very act of remaining steady, of observing without reacting, was a form of quiet justice. Each of them understood a fundamental law the master had never learned. The body can be broken, the voice silenced, the spirit threatened, but the mind remains untouchable. Awareness is autonomy. Clarity is freedom. And once awakened, it cannot be taken back. The pregnant wife stepped closer, keeping to the shadows, her gaze fixed on the barn. She had survived nights like this before, and she knew the final lesson of the night had been one without confrontation. Endurance shapes destiny. Fear may have held them for decades, but the truth had now permeated the room. She whispered softly to the child inside her, "See, Len, remember." Words meant for the life she carried, yet resonating with the 19, and with history itself, a lesson that would outlive every tyrant. The master's hands trembled as he clenched them at his sides, realizing he was no longer the center of control. The illusion had crumbled. He could still walk among them, still speak, still rage, but the balance had shifted irrevocably. Every glance he received reflected the same understanding. They had endured. They had learned. They had observed. And they were no longer bound by fear. This is the cruelest truth of all tyrants. Power built solely on the subjugation of others is temporary. The body can obey. The voice can comply. The lands can be held. But the mind cannot be owned. The 19, the wife, the unborn child, even the land itself, they had all absorbed the lesson. And the master was left with nothing but the realization that his authority had been a fragile illusion, and illusions are powerless against perception awakened. The barn, once a monument to cruelty, now stood as a silent witness to a different kind of power, the invisible, indestructible force of awareness. And for the first time, the master understood. He was no longer the master of anyone but himself, and even that mastery was slipping. History had recorded this night in whispers, not in chronicles, but its truth was timeless. Fear is temporary, oppression is fragile, and awareness is forever. The final chapter of that night unfolded in silence, heavy and absolute. The master, drenched and hollow-eyed, finally retreated from the barn, each step echoing like the slow tolling of a bell. He had survived storms before, endured resistance before, but nothing in his long life had prepared him for this. The awakening of minds he could not command, the collapse of fear he once wielded like a weapon, the realization that authority built on terror is a house of sand. Outside, the wife watched from the edge of the clearing, heart-pounding yet steady. Her defiance had become a beacon, a subtle, unstoppable force that had altered the dynamics inside the barn without her touching anyone. She had survived the tyranny of her husband, witnessed the endurance of those enslaved, and now bore within her the silent promise of a child who would inherit the lesson of that night. Perception is stronger than oppression. Awareness is mightier than fear. Inside the barn, the 19 remained motionless, absorbing the final moments. They had not celebrated. They had not spoken. Their power was quiet, formidable, and unyielding. Every subtle glance, every deliberate breath, every controlled movement had sent a message to the master. Your dominance is no longer absolute. You are vulnerable, human, fallible, and your illusion of power dies here. The barn itself seemed to exhale, carrying away decades of terror embedded in its walls, the heavy air finally lifted by the gravity of endurance, observation, and resilience. It had witnessed cruelty, and it had witnessed its unraveling. It had been a cage, and now it was a crucible, and the truth of what had transpired would not be forgotten by those who had endured it. The master, now reduced to a figure of panic and reflection, left the barn with every step a reminder of the fragility of his life's wake. He had ruled through fear, yes, but fear cannot survive clarity. Authority built on domination is nothing in the presence of awakened minds. And tonight, he had learned the unlearnable. Power is only as strong as the perception that sustains it, and perception cannot be commanded. It can only be awakened. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving an eerie calm. The sun crept higher, illuminating the barn, the fields, the faces of those who had endured, and the woman who had ignited a quiet revolution simply by surviving. She pressed a hand to her belly, whispering once more to the unborn life inside her, "See, Len, survive. Remember." The words were prophecy, truth, and instruction all at once. And as the master disappeared from view, a lesson echoed through the barn and across the land, a lesson history rarely records in chronicles but that survives in the quiet, powerful moments of the oppressed. Fear is temporary, dominance is fragile, and awareness is eternal. The night had ended, but the transformation it carried would echo for generations. And in that echo lies the dangerous truth every tyrant fears but can never erase. The mind, once awakened, cannot be chained.